We all remember recess growing up in school. Recess was a time of day where you could have all the conversations that you could not have while in class. Recess is where you had the real conversations. And real conversations we're going to have. In each episode of the Recess Podcast, I'm going to have real conversations explaining students and school. I'm David McGuire, and I'll be your host. It's recess time, y'all. What's up, everybody?
Hey.
Hey. It's good. Episode 24 of the Recess Podcast. I'm back pulling double duties. But this is episode 24, but it's episode 2 of the series, December to Remember. And I'm excited about this show. This is the second time this week that I'm going to get an education for myself. So I encourage everybody that's in the comments, like and share. You're definitely going to want to tune in. We have an awesome conversation here tonight that I know you all will thoroughly enjoy. So definitely tune in. Couple things I need you to do. Like I said, like, share this video, hop in the comments. We're going to engage and have a tremendous conversation. So without further ado, I'm going to open the floor. We had to talk about this beforehand, who was going to go first. And so solo screen first. Introduce yourself. Tell the folks who you are and introduce yourself to the Recess.
Hey, Recess Podcast. Good to be here with everybody. David, thanks for having us. My name is Angie Brito Rodriguez. I am from San Cristobal, Dominican Republic. Came to the United States in '96. Cincinnati, Ohio became our home before we moved to Indianapolis in 2013. I moved to Indy to get my master's in teaching and to serve as a Spanish teacher at Emmerich High School while fulfilling my commitment as a TFA corps member. I taught high school Spanish for 5 years before transitioning to Urban Act Academy, where I became a founding team member as a behavior specialist. During my time there, I've been able to do all kinds of awesome things. Among them, serve as director of instruction, and this year I have the pleasure of serving my school as an assistant principal. I'm super duper excited to be able to merge my love for languages, for culture, and for education in tonight's conversation. So David, thanks again for having us.
Absolutely. And last but certainly not least.
Hey, y'all. Thanks for having me. Thank you, David, for hosting tonight. My name is TeKolste. I'm also a Spanish teacher. I teach Spanish at Shortridge High School, which is the International Baccalaureate Magnet for IPS, Indianapolis Public Schools. I've been teaching for 5.5 years, and I also started my career as a Spanish teacher at Emmerich High School, and that was where my love for Brito began. She was my mentor teacher who taught next door to me, and I've had the pleasure of seeing, experiencing lots of fun and funny times as in my time as an educator and transitioning to a different role as an IB Spanish teacher at Shortridge 3 years ago.
So as you could tell from their background, the kind of the theme that we're going here with tonight's episode and its title, how can education in Indianapolis be more linguistically responsive? And so that's going to be our topic. Again, this is new for me, but something that I'm definitely interested in. For those that tune in know that I'm a principal at Tinley Summit, and as our student population is growing with our Latino population, and there's just a wave that needs to happen in an education and that people need to get and understand how we can make our schools more responsive to all students. And so I'm really excited about this episode. I hope those of you that are like me, learning new things, have questions, definitely pop those in the comment. Those that are listening that have experience and background, and Shamar, I see you there, but if you have experience and background, definitely tune in, engage in the conversation. Love for you to be in the comments. But before we go into that, I have to ask, because the two of you played a very big role back in November. So those that know that we had our elections was in November, school board elections here in Indianapolis and Indiana. The school board races dominated a lot of the election cycle, which was really awesome to see that children was put at the forefront. One in particular, obviously the IPS school board race. And I want you guys to kind of talk about your organization a little bit and how you all, played a hand. And again, a very important hand into this conversation for sure. So who wants to take it away? Angie, I'm gonna cold call you. You're gonna talk about it first.
I'm here for the cold call. So T and I had the pleasure of being part of TeKolste, which is the Teacher Alliance for Equitable Public Schools. As part of TeKolste, we just seek to be a group of teachers supporting other teachers so we can elevate our voices and be part of this public conversation around all things education, mainly these IPS school board elections that greatly impact our kids, our communities, our teachers, especially in the midst of COVID-19. And one of the reasons why we chose to be part of TeKolste and to form TeKolste was because as teachers, we recognize that a lot of decisions get made for us without us. And that was the problem. As an 8th grade and an 8th year educator, it was concerning to me that in my entire time of education, I never had anybody coming to my door communicating what school board was, what policies were being put in place. But as a student and then as a teacher, I was greatly impacted by those. And working at high stakes schools where the decisions are even more impactful to the demographic that we were serving, it was that much more concerning that we were never part of those conversations. So TeKolste was our attempt to be able to invite teachers to the table, to sit then with these upcoming school board members and change makers to make sure the changes they were making were a benefit for our students and our communities.
Man. And listen, and again, those that know, it was a very highly publicized race. And so when you think about, you guys as educators, the teachers and stuff that you work with, now that the dust is settled and election season is over and we have our candidates, what is it that you want to see from the members of the school board? So we're getting away from the case because they're now elected members of that school board. What is it that you hope that you see, and maybe not even speak to just IPS, we don't want to single them out, but what is it that you hope to see from school board members in general? So you talk about IPS school board members and Pike, Lawrence, Wayne, Washington. What is it that you want to see from school board members? And as in your organization, what is it that teachers want to see from those school board members in supports of schools and children?
I think for me, one of the most powerful moments of the campaign was a meeting that we had with Will Pritchard. And Will is a wonderful person. He's an IPS parent. He's been volunteering for the district. He's been doing his due diligence to really learn about the district. But he, went above and beyond to sit down with us multiple times and pick our brains about our experiences in the classrooms. And one thing that he said to us was, if I'm elected, I commit to meeting with this group regularly. And so I think that follow through on that commitment would be something that we would want from our candidates, and just more broadly on the same line, taking teacher input on decisions that are made at the level of the school board. I think that's the biggest thing that we stand for. Yep.
Had Will on the show. He was great. Definitely a great guest. And definitely I felt the genuineness from him, right? Not just as a candidate, as somebody that works in the community, but as you spoke to, as being a parent, right? Having that background as well. So absolutely. So again, so really awesome work you guys are doing. Keep it up. I think this is one of my experiences as a teacher was I had an opportunity to do Teach Plus and kind of get in front of policymakers and things like that and kind of learn how this works. And teachers do have a voice, right? And it's a very loud voice, but we have to use it in a productive way. So kudos to you all for that work. So let's jump into it now. So I start every show off with the same question. So I got to give it to you as well, because it's all about perspective. So how would you describe the current educational landscape in Indianapolis? Who wants to take it first?
I can go first.
Go ahead.
I think, so from an IPS perspective, I do think we're on the right track. We've seen a lot of momentum. We've seen a lot of people listening to teachers. If you look at it on a state level, and I know you asked about Indianapolis, but the fact that the very first question in one of the gubernatorial debates was about teacher pay, people are finally paying attention. We had these massive teacher raises in IPS negotiated by the union. We had Red for Ed getting a ton of publicity. Lots of teachers from all throughout the state coming in. IPS was very supportive of that, which I think was really positive. We have the leadership of a strong, super sharp Black woman who has an equity mindset. And you're hearing conversations at school board meetings already about how are we looking at the racial makeup of our choice and magnet programs. And not only are we looking at it from an enrollment perspective, but also from an academic performance perspective? These are conversations that were not necessarily happening 5 years ago in IPS. And I think it's a really great moment also too for Dr. Patricia Payne, who's been a wonderful consultant for the IPS schools. I just think there's a lot of momentum behind the Black Lives Matter movement, and IPS is finally able to like pick up on that momentum and have some really necessary conversations.
Absolutely. It's good to see Dr. Payne getting her flowers. She's been doing this work for a long time. And so it's good to see her get her flowers. So Angie, same question to you. How would you describe, the educational landscape here in Indy?
I agree with everything that T said, but when I think about our educational landscape in this bigger picture, right, of what it means for us to be globally and culturally, linguistically responsive, our city partners with so many cities internationally, in China, in Brazil, in Israel, and then our demographic, whether people are aware of it or not, is also one that is beautifully diverse. So I'm really excited to see our city's educational system become more reflective and culturally responsive to the needs of these global citizens that are welcoming into our city. So while I agree that we definitely have some serious momentum and things moving in the right direction as it relates to our stance on equity and the things that we're seeking to do to make education equitable and accessible to all kids, I just think that there's so much more work to do. And I think that COVID has lit a fire. Unfortunately, like the tragic events of this year have also lit a fire to get the ball rolling a bit more aggressively. But I'm excited for not only the fire to be lit, but for it to be continuous beyond this pandemic to ensure that kids have access to technology, period. Not just because we're going to be in virtual instruction, to ensure that statewide, citywide documentation around things happening in education are always translated, period. Not only because we're in the midst of a global pandemic, that funds are increasingly allocated to support students in high risk and high need areas, period. Not simply because a pandemic created a heightened awareness of the need that we knew was already there. On a state level, we know that a few years ago, the good old state of Indiana declared some standards for every student in Indiana. But then they also publicly declared, well, we know that some kids are just having some obstacles, that they're having a hard time making it to this standard. So instead of giving them all these tools, we're just going to lower the bar for those kids. So I'm excited for our state to be able to raise their bar and their perception of what our kids can do and to put money behind that belief as well.
Absolutely. And, the bigotry of low expectations, right? But it doesn't mean that we have to carry those same low expectations for our children. So tonight's show, the question is simple, because while we're here, what does it mean to be linguistically responsive in teaching? Like, what does that mean? And so let's define that before we kind of dive into it. So what does that mean to be linguistically responsive in teaching?
I think you can start by taking the definition from Cherokee Hawley in his book, Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Teaching. And I also want to add, I totally agree with everything that Angie just said. I think culturally responsive teaching is a buzzword right now, and people forget that culture and language are intertwined. And you can't have culturally responsive teaching without linguistically responsive teaching. But if you look at the academic definition of linguistically responsive teaching, it's all about eliminating the deficit perspective. So ELL is not a deficit title. The fact that you speak a language other than English in your home, it is an asset. And in fact, we could start to think about our students as emergent bilinguals, or in some cases, already trilingual, multilingual polyglots, right? And so we should really not be looking at ELL from a deficit perspective, and we should be elevating the home language that's spoken. So not only elevating that and celebrating it, offering bilingual diploma options, but also encouraging an environment of validation and code switching. So, I'm not going to shame my students in the Spanish class or the English class for using informal vocabulary. I am, however, going to teach them to code switch between academic and informal vocabulary. So I think that's a big part of it, whether you're in a world language classroom or not.
Why do you think, to the ELL piece, why do you feel that people label it as a crutch or a handicap for those scholars, and not, like you said, not as an asset? And why don't schools, and I'm even talking to myself, when you have a growing population of Spanish speaking students, why don't you use that to the advantage and try to uplift everybody and teach everyone, right? Instead of making them conform to us, why don't we all just conform to each other, right? Why don't we get more comfortable with their needs? Why do you think people are afraid to do that? Schools are afraid to do that and things like that?
I think part of it comes from Ignorance at its basic definition, a lack of knowledge. So we go back to this definition that T gave us. So we have ELL, meaning English language learners. There's also additional terminology that would call them MLLs, or multilingual learners. And at a foundation level, we've got to know that ELL, MLL does not mean Spanish speakers. It does not mean Hispanic students. It does not simply mean immigrant students. ELL, MLL specifically speaks to the fact that there are students who speak languages, like T said, that are not English. So one, I think having that basic understanding is foundational to helping people be able to make the bridge or connection to supplying those resources. So then secondly, if I'm honest, it's also a place of comfort. It's a lot easier in my mind if the secretary speaks English, if the English teacher speaks English, if the editor teaches English, the cafeteria lady speaks English, you're the only one who doesn't speak English. What makes the most sense is to help teach you, non-English speaker, to learn English, because you're immersed in English around you. And truthfully, it requires a level of like vulnerability and teachability of the educator hosting them to be able to be like, okay, like in order for me to best meet you where you're at, I'm gonna have to also learn how to speak your language. I'm gonna also have to learn some of the cultural dynamics of where you come from so that I can best serve you. So I'm Dominican, full blown. In my house, we spoke Spanish growing up, to the point where if we spoke in English in my house, I was getting in trouble. My mom was snapping at me in the car, pulling me over so that we could speak in Spanish, because they're very adamant about us not losing our culture, like that came through our language. But then I become a high school Spanish teacher. And not only am I teaching grammar or Spanish vocabulary that is not native of where I am from, but then I'm also teaching Honduran students, I'm teaching Mexican students, I'm teaching Colombian students whose base vocabulary is not the same as mine. So there are some words that for me as a Dominican are grossly inappropriate to Mexicans, and vice versa. So in that Spanish class, I had a level of power and authority with my language where I could say, because we're in this classroom, when it comes time for us to complete this writing assignment, you are to use the vocabulary that I taught you for the word sock. I know in your culture, sock might be calceta, and in your culture, it might be calcetín, but as a Dominican, it's media. So you have to use that word. And instead, I couldn't do that, right? That's not linguistically responsive. That's not helping my students learn. So as an educator, I had to be stretched and be like, okay, so sock is media to me. What does it mean to you? And just seeking to be, again, like teachable and adaptable to be able to meet our kids where they're at, and busting out of your own comfort zone so you can help that student learn, which is impossible if they're stressed out because they can't get the language.
See, I knew I was going to get off topic or get off script with my questions, because now I have like 10 more about what you just said. And I think it goes to where you talk about the differences in the Spanish language, right? And how in one country, this means something else. In another country, this means the complete opposite. And you shouldn't say that. And how it's like, as we're trying to adjust and learn, you have to learn, right, the different Spanish-speaking cultures, right? So like you said Honduras speaks one way and Mexican students speak another way, right? So as schools grow, right, you can't just lump all the Spanish-speaking children into one bucket and say, boom, here we go. And I think I've been guilty of it. We've been guilty of it. And I think that's the point, what I'm trying to get out of this episode for me and everyone that's listening, right? It's not linguistically responsive to just say, yep, I'm speaking Spanish and we're going to, right? That's not it. That's not even scratching the surface, right? It's more to it, and it's the culture piece. So can you guys talk to me about how big a part the culture immersion plays into the idea of being linguistic, and along with the language is important, but also how the culture ties into the language when you're talking about being more responsive when it comes to that?
I always think about, so when we were at Manual, we had the opportunity to serve a large Burmese refugee population, and that was amazing. It really opened my eyes to a lot of aspects of the refugee experience that I just had no idea about, and Burmese culture, which I otherwise would have had no exposure to. So that was really beautiful. But a couple of pieces of that, which I think are really important when I think about culturally responsive teaching, and like that taught me a lot. One, and we say this in Indianapolis with our Burmese population and with our Mayan languages, there are so many language varieties of these languages that in some cases, our students, of course, they were from the same country, they couldn't communicate with each other in their native languages. So that's really important to take into consideration when you're hiring and when you're going through interpreting processes to make information accessible to your families, that there is a vast array of minority languages spoken in the world. And so you need to be really familiar with what specific dialects and language varieties are being spoken by your students. But I also think about something that I think really exemplifies this issue of culturally responsive teaching. Like in many Asian cultures, eye contact is considered a sign of disrespect. In Western culture, oftentimes, if you're not making eye contact, that can be considered disrespectful. So just thinking about, I think it was Dr. Aziz who used the phrase like behavior is culturally mediated. So always trying to like unpack the knapsack of all of your students' behaviors and think about like, is this coming from a place of culture? You know, and am I just assuming the worst or the best intentions within my student? I think that's really important.
And I'm a school leader and I'm asking, but if school leaders were to ask you, how do we get our schools? So we'll talk about schools and the city in general, but let's first just talk about individual schools. What can individual schools do to be more linguistically responsive? What would you encourage them to take if they say this is going to be something we focus on this year? How should they go about it? What are some of the best practices? What are things that you advise them to do to be more linguistically responsive?
I think for me, two main things come to mind. One of them, I think, is really seeking to have a genuine conversation, like with parents and families. One of the most powerful things I did in my classroom when I was a teacher was asking my students to define what respect looked like, what it sounded like, and what it felt like to them. And to T's point, for some students, like eye contact was really crucial. And for other students, that was really uncomfortable. I think the same thing happens with our families. Like if we understand what they deem the education experience to be like and what it should be like for their students, they were also better to cater to them. I remember when I was in school, I came home, you know, that weekly behavior report, and my behavior report was in red ink. And my dad didn't read a single word that was on that paper because as the son of a principal, as a former teacher, he knew that red ink meant I was messing up. And I got in so much trouble that weekend because I got a behavior report in red ink. Mind you, there was nothing negative on the behavior report. So I had to go to be like, hey, miss, like, well, next time you send a paper home, like, don't use red ink. Because I don't know over red ink. So I think sometimes being able to create a space, able to get to know your students, their families, and their cultures. So you get to know those kind of nuances, I think is super special. Two, I think that when we think about like hiring and onboarding, being very considerate of what we deem to be appropriate professional behavior and identifying which lens is shaping what is deemed to be professionally appropriate or not. Because I think that part of being linguistically responsive is also this like culturally responsive piece. In the PD, I remember that we had this like part of our HR training. We were told that we were to never physically embrace or have physical contact with our students or our families. And then we also weren't allowed to accept gifts. Now I understand that there's a component of that where it's like, oh, that could be like the first step of sexual harassment, or that could be like bribery to be able to alter your students' grades. But in Hispanic cultures, a traditional or respectful greeting is for people to kiss each other on the cheek. And in Spain, it's 2 kisses. And in Argentina, 2 kisses on the cheek. So what do I look like if I'm seeking to have a respectful relationship with a Hispanic parent who's seeking to honor me by greeting me that way? And I'm like, no, ma'am, you're trying to get me fired. That's awesome, right? To my parent. Or those that I remember, like, I got gifts all the time, like tamales around Christmas time as a way of saying thank you for support that was provided to their child. So those are just 2 things that I think about and kind of all lumped together about really seeking to create spaces within your school calendar to not only present services to your families, but also to create a space for them to come and teach you about what their culture is like.
And that piece about the gift, like you said, it's very important. And it's almost a sign, like you said, it's a sign of disrespect if you don't take it, right? Like, you know, because this is their way of saying thank you, right? Especially when you talk about education, right? educating their children, and when specific, holidays come up in those cultures, like, and just those things. And I think, that is a big piece. But we as schools do have to look at some of our policies and practice on that. So what do you think about that question? Like, what are some things you would advise schools to do or encourage schools to do if they're looking into being more serious about being linguistically responsive?
I absolutely agree with that. And I also think something that's really important is that we're fostering the mother tongues of our students to the extent that we can, and really pushing ourselves to hire people that are capable of doing that. So I think about, in IPS, we have a huge increase in Spanish-speaking families. If we're not fostering the Spanish language skills, academic skills of those students, that is a serious missed opportunity. So we need to be looking at early childhood bilingual programs, biliteracy programs. We need to offer heritage Spanish classes that are not a waste of our students' time, that are genuinely preparing them for success in college Spanish so that they can use Spanish in their jobs and in their lives. They're already coming to us almost there, right? So it's our job to push them to the next step. And then I think another piece of it is, I think about Spanish class, right? So the IB has a tendency, it's a European program, it has a tendency to be a little bit Eurocentric. So in Spanish class, how is my class not only about Spain? How am I also talking about, my Peruvian students' Incan ancestors and, the genius of my Mexican students' Mayan ancestors? How am I also including that in my Spanish classroom? Indigenous people, Afro-Latinos, marginalized groups in Spain, like that's a huge component to being culturally responsive. And I think it cannot be left out of the Spanish classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so I'm gonna put you two on the spot. We talked about schools. Now I'm gonna put you in a seat and here on the Recess podcast, you're now talking to some of those decision makers. So we talked about what the school can do. When we talk about linguistically responsive, what can we do as a city? I have my thoughts of what we can do. What can we do as a city, right? Because again, it's great to do it as a school, right? But you need some of that. You need a larger body that can help push this as well, because it can't just be within the school walls. These students and that type of responsive must extend outside of the school walls into our community, into our city. So what things do you think our city can do to do better, to be more linguistically responsive? I know I'm putting you guys on the spot, but I would love to know from a city standpoint,
I think in the same way that we want teachers and school leaders who are culturally, linguistically responsive to our students' demographic, we also need to see leaders who are culturally and linguistically responsive in places of power. We, like T mentioned, we have folks who are Burmese, Chin, we have a large Syrian population, we have a growing Haitian population in Indy. So with all of those people being represented, there should in the city and the consumers and those who are paying taxes, right, contributing to our economy, they should have leadership that reflects them, their ideals, their values, their interests, their experiences. With this incoming refugee population, like, why isn't there a department that's solely dedicated to supporting or educating folks that are within the refugee population? And I think that while there may be one office in the city that's solely dedicated to that, I think that every single aspect of our city should have folks who are dedicated to being educated about those things and really providing a lot of those services. I know that because of COVID, the city was pushed to have to translate a lot of these really important documents to make sure that everybody had access to them. That should be a priority, period. And I know that there have been some folks fighting really hard to make that happen a long time ago. And again, COVID lit the fire. So just making all of these things accessible to people on a continuous level and having leadership that reflects them, their experiences, I think is super duper important.
I agree. And I think another highlight of the school board campaign was this nugget from Diane Arnold, she started an early childhood bilingual program at the Hawthorne when she was the executive director. And I don't think that Diane knew Spanish at the time. And so we were asking her, how did you do it? Obviously we would love to have something like that in IPS, but we just don't have the teachers. There's a teacher shortage period. There's especially a bilingual teacher shortage. So what did you do? And her answer was essentially I grew my own. So she took bilingual staff from Hawthorne and she helped them get their certificate so that they could be early childhood practitioners. And that's exactly what we should be doing. I mean, we have momentum behind the Crispus Attucks educator program. There's plenty of bilingual students in our district, we need to be encouraging them to become educators, giving them scholarships to become educators if we can, and encouraging them to go in IPS and incentivizing them to stay in IPS. So that, I think, is a really big piece of it. I also think that ELL differentiation needs to be a part of the teacher evaluation process, because, I mean, we're talking like pie in the sky about the things that we want to see. And to be frank with you, like, there's not always compliance at the schools just in terms of like the ILP, which is the legal document that sets the services that the students require. So, I mean, we really need to be pushing teachers not only to comply with the ILPs, but also to differentiate and really meet the needs of the ELL students.
Yeah. I actually just did some research before this, and it's only in the past couple years that the DOE has kind of cracked down on the requirements for people to serve as ELL teachers, right? Before you could just put somebody in that role, right? That you felt, and unlike, you couldn't do that in SPED though, right? Because SPED was protected by Article 7, you know, so they had to have the proper certification and training. And so it's really good to see now that the DOE is trying to crack down on schools and make sure that they do have those people in those positions, that they are getting the proper training and proper certifications. And we're holding true to those students' ILPs, because they're just as important as the students that have the IEPs, right? And again, it not as a crutch, but to make sure that until our system changes, right, that these students have a fair shake in the game with their needs and requirements. Because as you said it, with the curriculum being Eurocentric, right, it's not designed and it wasn't built for them. And so there is a need to make sure that they get the supports that they need in order to make sure that they can operate. But before, they just kind of got, those kids wouldn't get those minutes that they deserved, and it was okay, right? No one got no harm, no foul. But where students with IEPs, you miss their minutes on there, you know, you're likely to get sued. And as you should, but it should be the same way. So I'm glad to see that they're trying to crack down. One of the pieces that I want to see is, again, I went through, is representation on the board. So while you do have some board members, right, that may speak the language, right, and may have spent some time, I want to see that representation on the school board, right? I want to see that, you know, that Mexican parent or that Puerto Rican parent or that, you know, Burmese parent or you know, or you know, those parents that represent the culture that's represented in that district, the same way that we would do when we said, you know what, we need more Black candidates on this school board because the Black student population is growing, right? And so while I think, again, speaking the language is great, what are we saying to those students when they can just look at their school board and see someone that looks just like them, or that parent that walks into that school board meeting, right, and they see that parent that looks just like them, right? That's the piece where I want us to see us go. I want us to be more intentional about the candidates that we recruit and actively go out and empower those parents from those cultures to speak up and be on those school boards, because that's how we really get a makeup in the right diverse of school boards. So I know we talked about school board earlier, but that's something big that I want to see. What are your thoughts about that?
I think it goes back, though, David, to a matter of access. If I, as a teacher, didn't have access for a long time to information about who the school board candidates were, when their meetings were, what they're making decisions about, as an educator in the school building, how then is a parent to have access not only to like who the school board is and what they do, but then how to become part of the school board process by attending a meeting, by running to be a candidate. So I think it's more than that, because we need access to the education to be able to be those change makers. And again, if those students on a state level are second, third, back of the mind for the state, then that's reflected in the city. And then access to that information for those parents isn't a priority. I think that there's, to me, a very intentional reason why there's a certain demographic on school boards in general. It's like, how do those parents then have access to the board? How do they know that a school board exists, that they're making moves? How do they know to show up to the meeting and push back on any of these things? So I think it's also a matter of how can we equip parents even now in this process to know, like, hey, like, this is how you can become, your name can be on this ballot to advocate for other kids the same way you advocate for your own child. And I think about my family in particular. We were green card holders the whole time we've been in the United States. And it wasn't until my third year of teaching where I finally decided, okay, and it's time to become like a U.S. citizen. And that decision was extremely difficult for me because as a Hispanic immigrant raised in the United States, people don't know what to do with a chocolate face that speaks Spanish. So being able to wave my Dominican flag was a way of being able to affirm to people like, no, like I'm Dominican. And that's where I'm from. Like I'm proud to be Dominican. So to me, I was holding on to that for so long. But then in my classroom, I had this mantra that my kids were world changers. And I recognized that through an election, through the voting process, I have the ability to impact in ways that I can't, that I couldn't as a green card holder. So then as I became a U.S. citizen and became active in the voting process, and then through the Circle City Leaders program, learned about like campaigning and what it means to go TV and get out the vote and who people target, it made sense to me why I never knew about school board. Because my parents weren't able to vote because they were green card holders and not U.S. citizens, my household wasn't a priority when they were getting out the vote. They didn't care to educate me or my parents about school board election, about city elections, about national elections, because our vote wasn't going to move anybody's needle. So then how can we also educate our candidates to still prioritize the people who can't vote for them, but who are still greatly impacted by their choices? And I think that these are the times where we got to educate people to empower them to want to care about those things. Because even though, again, I can't vote for you, but there's plenty of kids like me in our current like school system who need people to advocate for their ELL rights. But if you don't know about them, you don't care about their story, then how are you going to advocate for them?
And advocate for them knowing that they can't give anything in return, right? I can't give you my vote, but I want you to be my voice, right? And but that takes a special type of person. So you know, around that, you know, that representation, you know, what's your thoughts on that when you see Sarah, these school boards races and these school board makeups and how, you know, it's someone who you understand and you're learning and you're teaching that they don't represent that, right? They have a large, you know, Spanish speaking culture and nobody on the board speaks any Spanish. It's like, or, you know, anything to get, we talked about translation. So what's your thoughts about, you know, that whole idea?
I just think that we just spoke to the tremendous potential of TAFEs and just like teacher activism in general. I mean, Angie is so well-spoken and she just said everything so beautifully. And we've had some of these conversations with the school board candidates and with other organizers and over the course of the elections. And truly, I think eyes were opened. And these are the things that people need to be hearing. So I just, I mean, I think that there are some barriers that are really hard to overcome. Obviously, I think that the undocumented community in Indianapolis is so disenfranchised, and those are really difficult challenges that I don't know how we're going to overcome. But I think we're having the right conversations is all I'll say.
And that piece about, you know, the undocumented population, one of the most powerful and breathtaking moments being in a school leader was like, you know, I had a family who you know was undocumented, you know, and I was trying to, you know, get them to get involved, right? Their students were doing great, honor roll students, and was being celebrated they didn't want to come because of the fear of being in that public place, right? Like being out there, right? So much so that they even put pressure on their children not to like be stars and be out there, because the more you're out there, right, the more your name is out there, the more people see you, right? It's that fear that the wrong person sees you and now there's a target on your back. And that tells me there's a system issue. When a child can't shine and be celebrated because of fear of repercussions, right? That speaks to a whole nother issue, right? But there's so many stories like that that's happening in schools. And when we are upset when those parents aren't involved, we don't even think about that. That could be, it's not because they don't want to be, it's killing them not to be. And just something we think about. So when we think about this linguistically responsible, when we turn it on to being more equitable, right? Why is this important when we talk about equity in relation to the education that children receive, right? How does linguistically responsive relate to the equity piece for what children deserve in schools?
I think you can look at the data around academic achievement in the United States, and you can see that it is predictable based on gender and race. And you can also, I mean, there's an abundance of linguistic studies that have been done that point to specifically African American English being marginalized in schools and those students being disproportionately referred for SPED. And then also English as a second language being disproportionately referred for SPED. So I think it's a fundamental lack of understanding on the parts of the teachers of what it means to have to code switch every day when you come to school, and how that's not necessarily a deficit on the part of the student. So I really think it comes back to, like, our teachers need to have an understanding of linguistics, honestly, and they need to be better formed in anti-racist teaching practices.
Which should be a requirement to get a teacher's license, but that's another reason. That's another show for another day. But
Agreed.
Again, listen, and I say this and people jump down my throat. If you feel that it's important for a teacher to sit, and we all did because we were teachers, sit through a 3-hour course on suicide prevention, then how can you not think it's important to have teachers sit through a 3-hour course on how to be culturally responsive, linguistically responsive, and to not be a racist, right? Like, those things should all be a part of the teacher license, right?
Amen.
And again, this is not me saying that, saying anything bad about suicide, because it does happen. But you know what else happens? Kids being targeted, right, from racist teachers, right? Or kids being, like, that also happens just as much, if not more, than a kid possibly thinking about committing suicide. It's actually partially maybe the reason why they're thinking about suicide, because of the way they're treated. But, you know, that's just my thought on that. And I just think that those are the pieces when we talk about teacher preparation programs, right? These are the courses or conversations that need to be had. I know TFA is doing things like that. I know ITF is doing those things, but I'm speaking more towards IUPUI and Purdue and Marion and IU and who am I missing? Notre Dame and all these teacher preparation programs and undergrads that aren't having these conversations, or they're just sprinkling it into the course of, I don't know, classroom environment. Then they just have a section on that. So Angie, for you, from an equitable standpoint, why is this important if you want kids to receive an equitable education to be linguistically responsive?
For the same reason you have IEPs, for the same reason you seek to have Black and brown teachers, for the same reason you want to increase teacher pay, for the same reason you want kids to have various post-secondary options, for the same reason, because every single student deserves access to a quality education, period. Whatever that means and whatever it takes. If you're going to differentiate to meet this SPED student's IEP, then go ahead and differentiate to meet this student's ILP. If you're going to seek to adapt the way that you use pronouns to meet this student's need, then also make sure to make this adaptation to meet this other student's need. It's all for the same reason. If we as educators foundationally believe that we have the future leaders of our world and nation before us every single day, then why not maximize every single opportunity to make sure that young person is equipped to do what they feel called and led to do? If we truly believe these things about every single student in our seat, and if we choose to spend all this money to get our masters, if we choose to update our LinkedIn so we can get this new role, then put in that same energy and money to be developed so you can meet the needs of a greater variety of kids, because our kids need it. And you're going to be a better educator for it. I can't tell you, like, the amount of things that I learned from my kids. And I'm an immigrant, right? Like, I speak Spanish, but there were stories and experiences that I was absolutely oblivious to. And simply allowing myself to listen to my students and to hear their stories has impacted who I am as an educator and as a human being. And I do that on a plethora of levels, whether they're ELLs or not. And we choose to adapt and support them in those things. So this is one more way that we can love and serve our students better.
Man, would you say that foundational responsibility, right? Like that's to the core, right? Like it's to the very essence. Both of you guys definitely, because again, like all of it ties together, right? When you talk about equity, right? And we have a list of things that we want. And oftentimes on the list of the educator wish list for what we want, that we're not putting that on there, and we should. And I think that's what we need to get to. So let's take this conversation into the space that we're in now, right? This virtual setting, right? Paint the picture for us, right? For those students, the students who we're referencing, right? Who are not being supported, who weren't being supported when school was in session before COVID. What is it like now for them, and how can schools in a virtual setting make sure that they're trying to access those kids? Because again, you know, that they're part of the student population that folks will write off and then use it as an excuse with COVID, right? Well, you know, it's hard to do that in a virtual setting. What do you mean it's hard to do that in a virtual setting? Right? I've literally heard that, and people know I got it. I get in trouble for my tweets, so I didn't tweet that. But I've heard people say that it's hard to reach our Spanish-speaking students in a virtual setting. So, you know, when we think about this virtual piece, this COVID time, you know, paint the picture from the stories you've heard from families, from students, from teachers like you all who teach those students, how this has been, you know, for those students and those families.
I mean, I certainly don't have the answers here, David. Like, this is something that I'm trying to figure out as I'm going, to be perfectly honest with you, because it is, I mean, the struggle is so real, to be able to even just have like FaceTime with my students every day. The struggle is real. And I think this has been a time, I mean, the pandemic has definitely changed education for good, for the long haul. But I think one aspect in particular, which is especially relevant for our Spanish-speaking students, is the idea of parents as partners. We've relied on parents so much, especially for the younger grades, to play a much larger role in their students' education. And if the parents don't have access to it because it's not linguistically accessible to them, then it's impossible, essentially. So it's really forced teachers, I think, to think really critically about how are they engaging parents, how are they building relationships with parents, how are they overcoming linguistic barriers. And I mean, hopefully that's going to last, you know, and play out after the pandemic is over. But to be honest with you, I mean, I think it's a lot of the same answers that you would use in a traditional classroom setting of like universal design for learning. When we're talking about adapting and differentiating, like that's just good teaching. Like it's kind of a universal truth. So I don't know. We're just doing the best that we can every day.
Absolutely.
And I second that, because the thing is, COVID just highlighted the difficulties that were already there. Because of COVID, our kids, now everybody has access to a computer. Because of COVID, now students that didn't have access to a hotspot. Because of COVID, there are now translated resources to let families know that, hey, school's going to be closing for this amount of time. Hey, translated support about where they can find like food. But that's exclusive to Spanish-speaking parents on a district level that I've seen resources for. So if you're a Burmese-speaking parent, a Chin-speaking parent, if you speak another language that's not Spanish, those resources are still not accessible in your native tongue. When I think about the daily student experience, though, now because teachers are doing so many things virtually and they're exposed to so many more resources, they've been able to find just more unique ways to engage all students in ways that also benefit, to T's point, that also benefit ELL students. So there's an app called Talking Points. And Talking Points is able to sync to your school's Clever and have your full like contact list. And any message you send to a parent will be translated to their home language. So if I, as a third grade teacher, need my students to log on to Zoom at, 2:15, and I send it out in English based on the language that is registered for them, they'll receive it in that language, which is a resource that folks didn't tap into before because there was a dependency on, calling the parent or having the parent come in. So that resource is super helpful to do that. Because of virtual and seeking to find ways to engage students, there's apps like TeacherMade or whiteboard apps where every single student now has this additional visual component to help them present their work. Or because things are visual, because everything's on camera, they found this different books or just different ways to deliver content in ways that are more visually engaging that again provide that additional support for EL students. But back to what she's saying, it still comes down to that like parent piece. If a parent is able to be alongside their child, but they also like don't speak English, then now you have two people who are seeking to understand the same content. And sometimes because of that collaboration, they're able to help each other and then advance things forward. I have parents, because they know that I speak Spanish, are able to advocate for their student and get support for their student because they have a Spanish-speaking administrator to like talk to. But I gotta make sure that I'm equally as accessible to my Spanish-speaking parent and my Chinese-speaking parent or my Patois-speaking parent. So the challenges are still there. We're just seeking to be a bit more creative, and some of the virtual resources allow for that creativity in that space.
Absolutely. And I would say, shame on me and shame on other school leaders who it took this, right, for us to be, to think about those things, like the things we translate, especially when you think about now we're quick to put up schools closed in English and schools closed in Spanish. I'm gonna use that example. But before this, we never wanted to put in Spanish, hey, we're having this parent meeting tonight, or we're having this Title I meeting tonight, right? But now, right, now we do it. And so I say shame on us, shame on me, and shame on us now. But the real question is, what are we gonna do after? Because I always tell folks, right, this COVID is a moment. And the things that we're doing to overcome it is a moment. The difference is what schools, what school leaders, what educators, what people are going to make this a movement. So are you going to continue on the other side of COVID to make sure that you're being more culturally responsive, linguistically responsive, you're making sure that you're translating these things into languages, you're keeping those apps, right, that you have to translate things, and not just saying, okay, now that things are back to normal, I'm going to go back to the way things were. And so that's what I'm trying to push to make sure that we are doing those things. And I think that's really important because, again, like you said, we've got to make sure we have an opportunity. COVID has given us an opportunity to rethink education on all fronts. The true question is, what are we going to do, after that's over? So we're getting close to an hour. I do have another question. And we talked about students in the pandemic and how they're falling behind, but I want to know, when you think about you guys' organization, I know we talked offline and it's still growing and there's still things that you guys are working through. But if you could speak to teachers, right, that are listening now, that will listen, that will have this shared, what advice do you get from them on how they can make their voice be heard? Because again, and this is not to advocate for a teachers union or anything like that. This is advocate for teachers speaking on behalf of their children. So what advice do you give for teachers in relation to what we're talking about being linguistically responsive, those that have the background, how they need to speak up louder, and those that don't, to learn more so they can advocate for their students? What advice do you have for those teachers?
So I've been thinking a lot about, this idea of these stories that we hear from our students that just completely blow our minds, that we wish every legislator heard these stories so that things could change and they could see that there needs to be a change. And in particular, I think about our undocumented students. Like, I really think if our legislators really understood what it meant to be undocumented, and in particular to be an undocumented child in the United States, that things would be different from a policy standpoint. And that's something that's like beyond the four walls of our classroom, but deeply impacts the four walls of our classroom and what we can do within them. So I think teachers in policy conversation is absolutely essential. Join TAPES, join the Teach Plus Indiana Teacher Network, get involved. I mean, consider joining your union if that's your style, right? Get involved in some way, because you need to be elevating your voice on behalf of your students so that we can impact some of these policies that are a barrier for us. And then in particular, white teachers, if you're not listening to teachers of color, if you're not reading things written by educators of color, then you're missing out on an opportunity to be the best teacher that you can be. And finally, bring your students' culture into the classroom, celebrate it. With COVID, with parents being so involved in our students' education, that's literally happening in their homes. This is a unique opportunity to do that now more than ever. So bring your students, parents, family members into your classrooms and celebrate that and treat it as an asset, because it is.
Love it. Angie, what you got?
Go off.
Right. Just show did just go off on the end there.
I think one thing I want to, let teachers know is that don't allow COVID to make you think that you're not a good teacher. One, I know that we've experienced our fair share of challenges, and folks that have been in the classroom for a long, long time. I feel like it's been year one all over again. It has been in a lot of ways, because there's so many new tools and new platforms to navigate, but don't let this year discredit all of the relationships you've built, all of the time you've invested, the love and you've invested to make sure that kids are learning every single day. I think on that same note, I would, as a teacher, politics and government just seemed really distant to me. And it seemed like a whole different world that I was not equipped or educated enough to be able to influence. And if I've learned anything through the course of this election, is that your experiences are invaluable. And the only difference between some folks that are running and are IPS school board candidates and that 8-year teacher, 10-year teacher, 12, 15-year teacher is the fact that that candidate had access to the campaign process. But teacher stories, teacher experiences, to T's point, are crucial, and you have what it takes to be able to represent your school, your students, and your community. With that being said, I would also invite teachers to be part of programs that give you that logistical background information about what it means to run a campaign, and to be part of a campaign. I had the pleasure of being part of Rise Indy's Circle City Leaders program throughout the course of COVID. And it was really, really just insightful and educational for me to be able to be exposed to the campaign process. Like, how do people pick like their platforms? How do they decide like who to target when it comes time for their campaign? How do they carry their message to their people? And teachers are master organizers. If a teacher can get 25 kindergartners to effectively complete any work for any focused amount of time, you can most definitely campaign, rally, and communicate your needs to countless people. So just use this COVID time where there's so many things online, there's so many Zoom conversations, all these podcasts, to educate yourself on the process. In the end, we invite you to be part of TAPES, but not because we are the end-all be-all, but because we want to learn alongside you and be able to learn from your story and see how we can use your story to help advance like the needs of all students. To just keep learning, not only to be linguistically responsive, but to be able to figure out how to best leverage your platform to elevate our students' voices. Your voice matters, and we need all of us.
Love it. So I'm gonna call you T, since we're at the end of it. I feel like we're now like family. T, I'm gonna put you on the spot because you made Angie go first. So how can folks that want to get involved with you, or where can they reach you at? Whether it's social media or Twitter, email, like how can folks who want to get involved or just learn more from you two and the things you're doing, how can they reach you all?
Absolutely. So you can find us at tapesindy.org. You can email Angie at president@tapesindy.org or me at chair@tapesindy.org. And we're also on Facebook under the Teachers Alliance for Equitable Public Schools.
There you go. Listen, I encourage folks, teachers, community members that want to learn more. Trust me, get involved. They gave us a little sample of the work that they did, the way they were able to bring teachers and the school board candidates together in a space during COVID and some of the things like that. I told you guys in the pre-show that I do shows that you learn from. And I said it's going to be professional development, and it turned into one of those episodes where I'm going to have to go back and say, I remember what he said or what Angie said about this, because this is one of those episodes. So again, folks listening live, share this. Trust me, you want to share this with teachers and educators and parents and people that just care about children and care about children receiving a quality education. And if you listen to this later on, after you listen to it, you will know what I'm talking about because you've heard the first 58 minutes of it. Share this with somebody. But again, I want to thank you too for coming on. I was really excited when we first met to do this show. And we talked about the theme, and I've been itching ever since, and it turned out better than I could have ever imagined. So I appreciate you all in any way that I can continue to support. Let me know when COVID is over and we can go have a drink safely. Drinks on me, man. Drinks are definitely on me. So I appreciate you. To everybody that always rocks with me, I appreciate you. I love you. As always, it's the Recess Podcast. Create the platform, control the conversation, change the culture. I'll see you guys next Tuesday for episode 25, and we're out of here. Have a good evening, everybody.